In order to really consider the good life, we have to think about more than just this life. We have to think about the traditions and the past from which we come and the future. We have to consider what we owe to those who came before us and what we owe to those we leave behind us. Without doing that, we end up making the mistake of isolating ourselves in a moment of time, and inside that, making all of our judgments. It's a kind of cultural relativism that I think most of us are guilty of. A sense that this here, the present, is all that really matters and all that really counts, and that the future and the past are wholly separate and will take care of themselves. Against this idea, I want to put this notion of the Iroquois seventh generation principle. You may be familiar with this, but the Native American group, the Iroquois, had a principle that they used to make any of their decisions. The idea was something like the present generation, the people who live now, owe it on some level to 7 generations in the future to make good decisions. So people living roughly 150 to maybe 200 years from today, those people. We're not trying to be metaphorically concerned with the future. We're trying to say look, 7 generations from now, your great-great-grandchildren will be walking around living their lives, and you owe something to them. And so the decisions you make now are going to have a direct impact on their quality of life. If you're only worried about you and yours right now, you're not actually worried about them in the future. Some of the people you despise right now, some of the people who are your enemies right now, are also people who are going to be part of your family in the future. They're going to be your great-great-grandchildren. You're going to have combined your family and their family's lives together in a way that is inextricable. So the idea here is that we have to think about things beyond the here and now. We have to consider the past morally. We have to consider the future morally in an attempt to understand what is really required of us here today. Now, that's really foreign, I think, to most of us. I think that many of us struggle to think about things like just 5 years ahead, let alone, 150 years or 200 years ahead. Most of our institutions reward short-term success. They look at quarterly returns. We look at, 4-year election cycles. The future feels really abstract, unreal, maybe even optional at that kind of distance. And we assume responsibility primarily for ourselves, our kids, our parents, something like that. It's rarely for strangers who don't exist yet, even though that's kind of who we're talking about. We enjoy things like roads, schools, energy systems, and rights that we didn't build ourselves, that past generations built for us. They built them to last, knowing that we too would get to use them. But we often recoil at the idea that we might owe something similar to the future. We treat inheritance as natural, but obligation as kind of intrusive. So, why should I care about people who don't exist? They cannot thank me. They cannot judge me. They can't punish me if I don't bother. On what grounds could they possibly have a claim on me? On what grounds do I possibly have a claim on my past ancestors? So, we're looking at this in different ways. We're looking at this morally in a sense of duties or rights or justice. We're looking at it politically, the idea of laws or institutions or policies. We're looking at it economically, the costs, the growth, the kind of debt we leave behind us. We're looking at it existentially. What kind of life makes sense to us now that would also make sense to those in the future and those who came before us? And so this episode is going to be an overview of how to live this kind of life that's looking both behind it and forward. Welcome back to American Socrates. I'm your host, Matt Rupert. Today we're looking at this idea of what we owe the future and what we owe the past. Older moral frameworks really tended to treat the future as real, like absolutely real. If you look at something like Aristotle's virtue ethics, you'll see that this was more of an orientation towards communal living, and that would include the communities of the future. It was not strictly a list of rules. It was not a list of commandments that you were supposed to follow. Moral life was aimed at becoming the right kind of person, the kind of person who made good decisions and knew how to function in their society. A good person thinks beyond their immediate gratification. It was that simple. Some things are good for you, but they're also good for your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren. And those are things that were important to consider. There's that metaphor that just exists out in the culture of planting trees you'll never sit in the shade of. This tree will not be grown and will not be producing shade by the time you die. And yet you plant the tree anyway because it will be there for your children or your grandchildren or your great-grandchildren or people that you care about. This isn't about charity then. It's not about some kind of sense of self-denial. It's about participating in something that lasts beyond ourself, that goes beyond our own life as individuals, right? It's an act that itself expresses who we are through our larger community. This sort of gets back to an idea I did in an earlier episode, that you really can't think of yourself as wholly contained within your own individuality. And that's a problem for a lot of us in our culture, because that is exactly how we are taught to think of ourselves. But if you can start to think of yourself in this extended way, that you are in fundamental ways related to your community, they made you the ego that you are, and you in turn make them, then thinking about things not in terms of what just makes you immediately happy, but in terms of what is going to last for future generations, what is going to help them, becomes an act of self-expression. It's not just making a painting and then having your name signed to the bottom of it. It's teaching people how to make art, teaching people how to understand the painting that is going to impact and give you lasting recognition as a human being. It's not Da Vinci's Mona Lisa. It's the fact that Da Vinci taught other artists and was so liked and respected by these other artists that they talked about him. He meant so much to them. He impacted their life in these fundamental ways. The future is not morally irrelevant just because you won't be there to experience it then. And a meaningful life must extend beyond our sense of personal pleasure and our own lifespan. So again, going back to the Iroquois idea of the seventh generation, it's a type of survival technology. This idea of sustainability and promoting the interests of generations who don't yet exist. It's a way of extending yourself and your culture and your ideas and your beliefs, which is interesting because in a way, it's a way of extending and thinking about traditions. Tradition is an interesting word. I mean, it comes from Latin, and it basically means something like to trade off or to hand off. It has the same root as our sense of the word trade, even the sense of our word treason. Treason means to hand off, but usually through an act of betrayal, like handing something over to an enemy. They have committed an act of treason. And so you've been given something that didn't really belong to you. This idea then of tradition is a handing down, not so much, I mean, originally it was in the sense of like private property, like, real estate or something like that, but more today of like beliefs and ideas, certain things that made you you and that were important for your culture and your time and your moment in the sun. You're handing those off to the future to preserve them and to guide them and to help them. If it doesn't help them, we could ask, does it need to be preserved? But the point here is that if we're not thinking about the future or the past, then none of this really matters. We're not going to be able to make good choices. We're not going to be able to outlast our own moment. We're going to die when we die. So Societies that ignore the long-term consequences of their decisions, they don't last very long. They disappear. They fade into obscurity. You don't even know them. We don't even know what those societies were because they were really interested only in themselves and their own self-aggrandizement. So we're not talking about idealism here. This is a kind of realism under specific conditions, right? I don't want to romanticize this. All cultures make mistakes. All of us are going to screw things up. The point here is not that we need to be perfect and then hand down our perfect moral rules to the next generation. The point is that we have trained our moral imagination to reflect on and include where our ideas came from, the flaws of our ancestors, and where our ideas might go, and the potential problems that we are going to be passing off like a baton to the next generation. Luckily for us, we have some understanding of how this works. We inherited a world that we did not create. The problems of our ancestors just got dumped on our lap. And sometimes they thought about that. They tried to make efforts to fix them for generations to come. And other times they didn't. They didn't even make an effort to try and adjust things so that we wouldn't share in those same problems. We are, at best then, temporary stewards of our culture. We picked it up from somewhere else. We're handing it off at the end. We are not its owners. We are not its masters. We are simply the people who have possession of it for a time. Responsibility then flows across this timeline, across generations. It's not sideways to contemporary moral concerns. It has a past, a genealogy, if you will, and it has a future. And those need to be thought about. Religion. Religion's a good example here. Judgments by descendants, by God, by history, often come up in religious sorts of conversations, right? You owe it to your ancestors to do this. You owe it to God, which is in a lot of ways saying the same thing. This historical prescient comes bearing in on us like the will of our parents. And I mean that kind of literally, like your parents write a will and they tell you what to do in the future, even though they themselves are dead. How their property should be divided, what you're supposed to do with it, where you're supposed to spend the money, so on and so forth. These covenants then are meant to bind generations together. They're meant to preserve something. They're meant to tell a people in the future who they are and where they come from. Religion can preserve this sort of long-term thinking, generally when politics and other things like that cannot. The political idea of our being is a very different thing, and it's very nebulous, whereas a religious idea really has legs. It has lasting power. Politics flitters in and out based on our current needs, what is right for the moment. It is a really temporal thinking, whereas religion tends to be more long-lasting. It has a longer arc. I think a lot of the problems that we see in our modern world today stem from this idea that we've lost religion, which is fine. We can give up the idea of a theology, but what we can't give up is the idea of a long-lasting arc of people. And that has seemed to have gone with it. So these frameworks that I'm thinking of here assume life is part of an ongoing human project. We can ask, what kind of self emerges when you believe that these future generations are going to carry your ideas forward and that you ought to set them up to be best served by doing so? If we contrast that with the modern, autonomous, self-authoring, short-visioned, narrow-horizoned self that we're generally pitched by capitalism, we can see that there's this kind of emptiness to it all. And that gives rise to a fear of death, which we've already talked about when we talked about Epicurus, is something that incredibly limits us and makes us feel small, and so is quite damaging. So there's this guy, Hans Jonas, and I'd like to introduce a little bit about some of his ideas. He basically argues that modern technology gives us power with our ability to delay large-scale consequences. Something like farming. We have the ability to farm, and that preserves us from droughts and other kinds of natural hindrances to our ability to go forward or succeed or whatever. So our modern technology gives us this longer, more lasting, more stable kind of life. But our moral instincts are strictly evolutionary, and they were evolved for face-to-face, short-term problem solving. This mismatch can be quite dangerous. It makes us think about things in the day-to-day aspect, but miss the sort of big picture, long-term ideas of what we're doing. Earlier societies would do things like overhunt the animals in their vicinity. They would overfarm the land so that the land became sterile. They would pollute rather locally until the point where they had to move because they couldn't live in the place they had built before because they had made it untenable. The damage was limited and often reversible in these early societies. But today, with our modern technology, we have the ability to destroy the whole goddamn planet. That sort of global, irreversible harm could be civilization threatening. It's not any different than what our ancestors were doing, but the scale has changed. It's changed so dramatically that we really need to consider what it is we're doing here. So one person's emissions seems pretty trivial to even talk about. Like if I'm burning coal or something like that to keep my house warm, who the hell cares? But when we take millions of ordinary choices and those choices reshape the system, we end up with massive changes. Absolutely massive. There's no villain required here. There's no evil cabal of people. It's not corporations or businesses or government or any of that. It's just inertia. It's just the way people do things sort of unreflectively, out of habit, without really looking at what they're doing. They're thinking about right now. They're thinking about today. They're just not thinking that far ahead. I do want to draw a kind of distinction here between fake and real futures. There are things like national debt, which is an accounting entry into a sort of made up ledger. There's these political narratives. There's adjustable rules, things that, we keep tally on or we keep score about that don't really matter. And if we just stopped thinking about them, they disappear because they were basically inconsequential to begin with. The national debt is very different from private debt. When I borrow money from you, I ought to repay you because you're a real person. When I borrow money from the nation, or when the nation borrows money from itself, the idea that we owe ourselves money is kind of a joke. If you had to borrow money from yourself, you could say you owe yourself money, but you could also say, that's just what I needed to spend to survive. That was just part of the cost of being here. But there are other types of futures where we have things like climate change. These are physical, natural processes, feedback loops. They're real tipping points. There are real things that can cause absolute damage to happen. And it's not that we can't reverse them or even fix them when we've gone, say, past a tipping point. But we can't do anything about it if we're not thinking about it, if we're not considering how to fix it. Now, I get the idea that if you're struggling, if you're having a hard time making ends meet today, then the idea of really worrying about tomorrow is kind of asking way too much. But if you're not worried about tomorrow, if you're only thinking about today, then the problems you're facing right now will be multiplied by 10 come tomorrow. And so that's the problem. You're not helping yourself at all. You're making things worse in the future, which means tomorrow when you get to the future, it's going to be worse. You can renegotiate things like national debt. We can just forgive ourselves national debt, but we can't renegotiate the physics of something like climate change. All right. Our economy is structured to reward short-term extraction. It really is geared towards that. The more we can grab up and the faster we can use resources, the more profit we can make, and that's what the whole system is built on. Costs are generally pushed forward in time to people who don't have any representatives right now because they're not born yet. And just like when the decision to make this sort of capitalist system was made, none of us were born. So the cost, the damages of all that have been shunted onto us, and we are shunting them into the future. But at some point, the buck stops passing, and somebody ends up paying the cost for all this. That kind of design feature is just not sustainable. We've normalized borrowing stability from unborn people. We've normalized taking this comfort now and shunting the risk into someone else. This would be unthinkable to us if the victims were right here, right now. If you had to look those children in the eyes and be like, I'm going to steal your future so that I can play more video games more cheaply, we would be horrified at who we are and what we are. So if we're going to live as this history that has culminated into us, then we have to also look at the future not as an abstract dumping ground for our problems, but as some place that we are already building with our actions today. If that responsibility dissolves when consequences are delayed, then we need to have some sort of mechanism for reclaiming that responsibility. To make this personal then, if your way of life depends on people inheriting damage that they didn't choose for themselves, what does that say about the moral story you're telling about yourself, the kind of person that you are? So I guess to get really concrete about this, we can't say that we owe the future everything, that our lives are just built in the service of these future generations. But neither can we say that we owe the future nothing. To be morally serious about this, to lead a kind of serious life, we have to find a way of balancing those sorts of extremes. One thing that we could look at is a sense of restraint, accepting that not every desire we have needs to be satisfied. Some comforts are simply incompatible with long-term stability, and so we're just going to have to live without those comforts. It's going to be fine. Everybody's going to live without them. No one's going to be putting you out. Responsibility always costs something. You cannot be a responsible human being and just live cost-free. We also need a sense of honesty here. Refusing comforting myths that say things like, oh, it doesn't matter. It's, like that's not our problem. I'm sure we'll come up with a solution. God will miracle us out of these problems. All of those sorts of myths, we are acknowledging the delayed consequences as morally real, but at the same time, shirking the responsibility for dealing with them. We face trade-offs. We have to face these trade-offs, but we have to do it without magical thinking. We also need to consider a sense of continuity here, leaving behind systems that will still be functionable in a generation or two. Institutions, environments, norms, belief systems, morality, even the technology that's going to be inherited needs to be thought about. It doesn't need to be perfect, but we do need to make an effort to make it viable for future generations. And we need to shift from policy to a sense of posture here. I don't want to create a checklist. I don't want to create this idea of ticking boxes to get to all the right things. I don't know what all the right things are, and neither does any one person on this earth. But I bet collectively, as we put our heads together, we can start to get a pretty good picture here. What we need is a way of standing in the world, a way of interacting with the world that isn't harmful, not to the world, not to the future, and ultimately then not to ourselves. We need that idea of stewardship rather than an idea of consumership. This should not be about what can we use, what can I get my hands on, what can I spend, what do I own. It should be what can I pass on that was even worth passing on. 9/10 of all the things you own are going to go in the garbage dump the second you die because they're worthless. Very little of what you possess actually has a place in the future. And so we need to think about that. We need to think about what are you holding on to that really should never have been purchased or maybe never even made. I want you to look at life then as a sort of moral witness rather than as something you need to conquer, something that you need to win. You're just here to help pass from tradition to the future. We need to try and translate that kind of seventh generation thinking into modern life. We don't need to be certain about all our outcomes, but we do need some sort of seriousness about this conversation, about the risks of not doing it. We need to act as though the future is real and that it's also really fragile and that it's really morally relevant, not just to the future, but to the present. We need to reaffirm what we're doing, that we owe things to the future. We owe them something, and that something has to reflect who we are, our character, not just our politics, not just our beliefs, but like who we want to tell the future we were. So this can seem pretty overwhelming. I mean, I often feel like just blown over by it. I think the best thing you could probably do if you want to try to just think about this whole situation, the past into the future and what that means for you, is to break it down into smaller domains. Think about what work means for your ancestors versus what work means today and what work could mean for your future, right? For your children or your grandchildren or your great-grandchildren. The same thing you could do with consumption. What does it mean to purchase things? What does it mean to have community? What did it mean to have community? What will community look like in the future? Same thing with parenting. What was parenting 100 years ago? What does parenting look like today? And what parenting might be tomorrow? Citizenship, politics, ideas, concepts like justice, race, sex, all of these things. You could think about where you found them, where they are today, and what they could be tomorrow. And that makes it a little easier to really wrap your head around. I think if you just try to think of the whole thing all at once, you'll just drown in it. Think about these questions then. If someone inherits the results of what we have today, what will they be inheriting? Will it be stable? Will it be fragile? Do we need to care for it? Can we afford to neglect it? The future will not remember most of us. It will live, however, with what we leave behind. Our impact will be felt, even if we're not remembered. We shape that future whether we intend to or not. The real question then is whether we're going to bother to do so responsibly or whether we're going to abdicate that position and just let our children wander in the wild by themselves. Thanks for tuning in to American Socrates. If today's episode of Philosophy got you thinking in new ways, make sure to subscribe so you'll never miss an episode. New, full episodes drop every Wednesday. If you enjoyed the show, leave a review. It helps others find us, and it means a lot. And if you know someone who could use a little more practical wisdom in their life, share this episode with them. Until next time, keep questioning everything.